Hit it. I'll start up. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the IUCN Bear Specialist Group North American Bears Expert Team webinar series. Rich and I, the co-chairs, appreciate the continued involvement of the committee members, as well as other BSG members from other expert teams joining us on the call. And I believe we have some people that are outside the IUCN on this call as well, and we welcome you. If we don't have a chance to say it later, we want to wish everyone out there a happy Thanksgiving, in the US anyway, and hope that everyone's travels and get together are safe and relaxing. And we hope that the poor folks in BC get their roads and railways fixed. What a mess. We want to remind folks that all our webinars are recorded and preserved online. Today's panel discussion will be placed there on our online spot after this presentation convenes. And so we're recording this and it will be available to be viewed again if you like. Like always, we'll finish within 1 hour to respect everyone's time. And don't forget that you can use the chat function to ask questions at any time. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation and there will be time for questions. We want to remind everyone except our speakers to mute your microphones and turn off your cameras to preserve bandwidth as we start the webinar. So let's get started with today's webinar, a relevant topic that discusses the huge threat to exist to bear species around the world from climate change. Today's discussion is called Climate Change and Warming Oceans and the potential cascading ecological impacts of these things to brown bears by Grant Hilderbrand and Garth Mowat. Take it away, guys.
Hey, good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's really appreciate Rich and Chris giving us a chance to make this presentation. It's something that I think for Garth and I, it's near and dear to our heart. And so we're kind of going to tag team the presentation as we go through. So I'm Grant Hilderbrand. I work for National Park Service up in Alaska. And Garth, if you want to introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. My name is Garth Mowat, and I'm the large carnivore specialist for the province of British Columbia in Western Canada.
All right, and hopefully folks can see my screen. Do you guys see a PowerPoint slide?
We can see it.
Awesome. Okay, good. Small victories, I'll take it. So anyway, yeah, as Chris mentioned, the title of our talk is it's all related to climate change and the potential impacts on oceans and how those can have indirect effects on bear species and the terrestrial environment. So just kind of an overview of some things we want to talk about is, I think we all think about the explicit effects of climate change in the terrestrial environment and how apparent those can be, whether it's things that we're seeing, whether it's permafrost or change in vegetation structure or fire regime, those types of things. But there's also these other large scale changes that are occurring in the marine environment that can have impacts on the terrestrial environment, just due to the linkages between the marine and the terrestrial ecosystem. And so we're going to focus on 4 different geographic areas, and we're just going to hand these back and forth. But they're all ones where we're seeing climate-related impacts, largely in a marine environment, but how they affect both bears, but also human-bear interactions as well. So I want to spend just a second on this map and point out a few important things. One is just the red circles indicate the 4 geographic areas we're going to talk about. To the north, it's Gates of the Arctic. We'll spend some time on Katmai National Park and then Kodiak Island, and we'll close with coastal BC. But I guess what I want to point out, why we thought this was an appropriate topic for this group, is what's depicted in green is generally the distribution of salmon. And so this is not an Alaskan issue. It's not a North American issue. This is one that really spans the entire Pacific Rim and includes brown bear populations in Japan and in Russia as well. So just to touch on a few of the major physical processes or changes that we're seeing in the ocean. One big one is loss of sea ice. I think we think about that with with polar bears in particular, but I'll show a slide on this in a second and maybe share some of the other reasons we're concerned or have interest about this related to brown bears as well. We're also seeing marine warming events, and we sort of get our events that are cyclic, but then we're also getting some other warm water events like the North Pacific blob, where we saw real substantial increases in ocean temperatures. Ocean acidification can be cause for concern. I'll touch on that in a bit. And then I also want to mention, not only are we seeing warming in the marine environment, and that's certainly our focus today, but we are seeing warming in some freshwater systems as well that can have ramifications for brown bears. So this is basically just sort of a map of sea ice, and you can see the median extent versus the recent distribution or sort of geographic extent of ice this past year. A couple of things to point out. I think we're all aware of this. It's not just that it's a reduction in the sort of the surface area of ice, but also the reduction in the thickness as well. What this could mean for brown bears, which again is the kind of the focus of our talk today, is one is we have concerns about increased Arctic shipping, and this is a much more direct supply route to get from Europe to get to Asia, and so the concerns we have there relate to maybe lack of infrastructure or response to spills should they occur. The other thing that's important and maybe beneficial of bears in some areas, though, is we may see changes or even increases in the runs of anadromous fish on the North Slope of Alaska. So a lot of dynamic processes here, but one that we don't necessarily always think about in terms of brown bears. This is just a map that sort of depicts some of these warming events in the Gulf of Alaska, and you can see just the extent of the warming and what we're seeing relative to historic averages. So some real significant warm weather events, and we first started noticing these really through seabird die-offs out in open water. But as we trace that back, part of the reason we were seeing these seabird die-offs was a reduction in their forage fish. And the forage fish that the seabirds tend to feed on are some of the same fish species that salmon will feed on during their the marine part of their life cycle. So we're talking about temperatures or events that are hundreds of miles from the coast, but still have the potential to impact salmon, which can impact bears. And then ocean acidification is another one we certainly think about as well, in particular in areas along the coast where bears may be feeding on things like bivalves. And it's not that these bivalves at this adult stage are necessarily all that vulnerable to changes, but some of their early life stages, they actually are. They're not as protected at that point. So it's some of the early life stages where we have concerns about implications for some of these invertebrates. What I want to do now is shift, and we're just going to talk specifically about a few different studies or a few different areas. I'm going to spend probably the bulk of my time on some recent work we did in Katmai National Park. So just for reference, it's depicted here in the red arrow. One thing, I think when folks think about Katmai, they think about Brooks. It's probably the most iconic site within the park. Our study area, though, was actually on the coast. So we were studying this Gulf of Alaska system. Brooks Camp is actually fed from the Bristol Bay side. So it's a whole different system in terms of the source of the fish runs and potential effects of warming. All that to say, what we're learning on the Katmai coast, I think, is specific to the Katmai coast. It doesn't necessarily relate to things that are going on in Brooks Camp. So the reason we started this study is the park had a variety of interests or reasons that they wanted to better understand this system. And one is we wanted to understand what resources were important to bears. And therefore, if we were to have a catastrophic event like an oil spill, could we prioritize our response if we couldn't be every place at once? And, for those of us in Alaska, it's something it's not abstract to us. We all went through the oil spill in 1989. And so this is a map of the oil distribution from the Exxon Valdez. The spill site is up in the upper right side of this map here, this red X. And we certainly think about Prince William Sound and the impacts of the oil there. And there was a lot, and the effects were significant. But if you look at the distance oil travel, they continued all the way down the east side of the Kenai Peninsula, a little bit in Kodiak, but it also went through Shelikof Strait. So this is Katmai National Park here. So the coast received a substantial amount of oil with that oil spill. So it's something that is real in terms of an issue or a topic the park wants to be prepared for. Another thing that we wanted to learn more about was how to effectively and adequately manage bear viewing. And this is an activity that is very much in line with the purposes of the park. That being said, we want to manage these activities in a way that they're not impactful. I do want to point out, just for future reference, you can see that a lot of the viewing activities are taking place in the sedge meadows. So just to walk through a little bit of our study design. So we were putting out about 12 collars a year for a 3-year study, a different set of bears each year. So each year was basically in the study for 1 year. Using GPS collars, a limited number of video collars, which you can see depicted here. We were focusing primarily on females to get an idea of changes in body condition, body size, and diet. So with each capture, we were weighing the animal. Just full disclosure, this is actually Lake Clark. It was a study we were doing to the north, so this isn't actually Katmai. We were also assessing body condition, so looking at percent body fat, so we could assess changes through the year. And then just doing a general health screen, get an idea of animal age, condition, look for any injuries or that kind of thing. Concurrently to our capture work, though, which we were doing 3 captures a year, we did spring, summer, and fall. So we could look at changes in diet, we could look at changes in body condition. Joy Erlenbach, who's pictured here, was also doing her PhD work on the Katmai coast. And she was doing a lot of observational work, largely replicating work that Tom Smith and Steve Partridge had done back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Do want to just sort of point out this island off in the distance. There's actually 2. There's a bigger one and then a smaller one right over here. I'll talk more about those in a second. So when we went into this study, a lot of Steve and Tom's prior work indicated the importance of bivalves to bears, particularly in the spring. And when people go bear viewing, they certainly see bears spending a lot of time feeding on bivalves. So we went in hypothesizing this would be an important resource for them, in particular coming out in the den. And we tended to view vegetation as probably being less important. We had run some isotope samples that Sterling Miller and Dick Sellers had collected when they handled bears right after the oil spill. And at that point in time, this seemed like a pretty sort of standard coastal system, with salmon being the driver and vegetation being the supplement. And so when we developed this study, I think we largely thought it was going to be a confirmatory study. And it's because there's not much in the way of sport fishing or commercial fishing. There's no bear hunting in the area. So we viewed it as basically a static protected system. When we looked at our GPS collars, this was the data, I believe from 2016, but each color represents an individual bear, each dot represents one location. And what you can see is an awful lot of site fidelity for the coast for these bears. Our entire study area was about 90 kilometers from Hollow Bay up to Douglas Head. So we had one bear that kind of made a bit of an inland foray, bear 15, but for the most part, they were really tightly located along the coast. But I do want to point out bear 85, the one in blue. She spent a fair bit of time on islands. So where I'm moving my cursor, that's the island that I showed in the background a second ago. And then she also spent some time up on these smaller islands called the Shikun Islands. And these are about 3 to 5 miles off the coast, depending on the tide. A few interesting observations. I just wanted to share this one. At first glance, people tend to see this as looks like a spawned out salmon carcass. But this is actually a fin whale. These are 2 large adult males that are feeding on this fin whale. What was interesting about this in terms of resources that are available to bears there is we do get marine mammals washing up, but all of the female bears that we handled in this area, we didn't see any sort of whale signature in their diet, and it seemed like this was a defensible resource that was largely dominated by these large males. When we went out to capture that one female that I showed that was off on those offshore islands, When we flew into Catcher, the island was probably about 300 meters long and about 100 meters wide. It was really nothing but kind of some rough beach grass. And so she'd been out there for weeks. We were really curious why she was spending so much time out there. And she was even out there in the fall. That's when we caught her. But as soon as we landed the helicopter, started seeing a lot of this kind of, at least for me, unusual looking scat. Found about 6 or 8 cached skulls and skeletons. And so became really curious why they were spending time out there. So after a little more investigation and some camera work, what we came to find was that we had a handful of bears that were coming to these offshore islands. They were actually actively preying on, killing, and catching both sea otters and harbor seals. And this one, I'll show you sort of a zoomed in photo in a second. This is a brown bear that's caught an adult sea otter. And all these little dots in the water back off in the distance, these are all harbor seals. They haul out on the opposite side on a beach. But, part of what was interesting is they would hunt these animals in different ways. So the sea otters tended to haul out on these rocks up here. And at low tide, the bears could go out pretty stealthily and stalk them and try and catch them. And they were effective at catching sea otters in about 10 to 20% of sort of their predation attempts. Harbor seals were really different. They would actually swim towards the seals. The seals would haul out on a sandy beach. They would swim at the seals from the water side and try and catch them before the seals could get into the water. This is just sort of a blow up from our fixed camera, the bear with an otter. So I do want to spend a second talking about sea otter because I can't really tell you the whole story without mentioning sea otters. So back when both Stephen and Tom Smith were doing their work, and also when Sterling and Big Sellers were doing their work after the oil spill, sea otters were largely not present on the Katmai coast. They're part of a threatened stock of sea otters, the Southwest stock. And they have slowly been recovering from the Russian fur trade and moving their way back up the coast. So if we go back to the late 80s or 90s, there were very, very few otters on the Katmai coast. And so this graph, let me pause for a second and share what this depicts. So this shows otter density for 3 different populations. The 2 lower ones where you see a little bit of noise, but in general, you can see the density is pretty consistent, about 1 otter per square kilometer. This is Western Prince William Sound, Kenai Fjords. And so these are places where the otters have been established for quite a while. But with Katmai, what we saw is that they went from virtually non-existent to pretty high numbers, up around 5 or 6 otters per square kilometer. And since 2015, we think they're going to come down and approach something more like carrying capacity. But when they showed up, the bivalves, the clams that were available, were largely, untouched. So they came in, foraged hard, reproduced quickly, slightly overshot the forage available, and we think they're going to settle out around carrying capacity, probably around 1 or 2 otters. So when we start putting together a lot of different information, and again, I just want to remind folks that this is a pretty static, or we thought it was a static system because everything's protected. But when we went back and looked at changes in salmon numbers through time, so these red lines basically sort of capture what we see as phase shifts. They're not statistical or mathematical in any way, but just in talking to the salmon folks, this sort of reflects what they thought they were seeing. So basically, it's the numbers they were seeing in surveys had dropped by about half, and we sort of saw this phase shift starting somewhere around 2005, 2007. At the same time, we leave salmon on this graph, but we add razor clam density. And what we've seen is a really substantial decrease in razor clam density as well. And we think this is mostly tied to the recovery of sea otter. If you recall, back in the 1990s, we had virtually no otter. So once they showed up, they started to really impact the razor clam density. So I mentioned that Joy was doing observational work on the coast, and she was repeating the scan surveys that Tom Smith and Steve did back around 1999, 2000. And we saw a really substantial decrease in the number of bears observed per scan. And so we're talking like a 70% increase. I want to be really clear. We're not necessarily saying there's fewer bears. There's just fewer bears being seen. We don't know what the population size is, and it could be a geographic redistribution. In any case, we see sort of a variety of things lining up. And so the last thing that we looked at is we had the dietary estimates that were done with those samples that Dick and Sterling collected after the spill versus what we collected during the study. And we just basically saw a flip in the primary dietary items. We saw salmon, the salmon contribution to diet drop by about half, from around 60 down to about 30%. And inversely, we saw the vegetation component increase dramatically. So a few key findings from this study. One, what you saw with the distribution of locations. Female habitat use is largely tied to the coast. We didn't have any females that hopped over to the Bristol Bay side. The number of observable bears has dropped substantially from the time that Tom and Steve did their work to our recent study. The proportion of salmon in the diet has dropped by about half as well. So all that said, the bears that we handled, that we worked on, were all in really good physical condition, and they were similar to what we saw for other populations. So in terms of the litter sizes we were seeing, the body weights we were seeing, the body condition, there wasn't any indication that the individual bears were stressed, per se. Based on the isotope work, the bivalves did not appear to be a significant food resource for bears. So this may or may not have been a shift from prior times. Certainly the otters have had the effect on the availability of bivalves and also the average size of those bivalves. And so people definitely see bears clamming, and bears do go clam, but it's just not something that shows up significant in their diet. What we do see is with reduction in salmon numbers and other shifts that are going on is sedge meadows are more important than we realized before. And so one thing I alluded to when we showed the picture of the bear viewers, I think in the past we encouraged people to view bears in meadows. And the meadows are not a limitless resource. And so I know one thing we're working with the park on now is, do we want to be more thoughtful on how people view bears and recognize that the time they're spending in those meadows is important as well. And sort of an extra factor is we will tend to have lots of different bears in the meadow at any given time. And so if a group of viewers impacts one bear, that can sort of cascade through the meadow to affect other bears as well. So with that, I'm going to pause and hand off to Garth, and he's going to spend some time telling us about some recent work on Kodiak. And so Garth, I'll take your cue whenever you want me to advance slides.
Okay, thanks, Grant. Well, this story is some work done by Will Deasy on Kodiak Island. I wasn't involved with the work. I'm just going to summarize it for you. And it's a neat story about timing of resources and how does that affect bears, individual bears and bear populations. And maybe, Grant, we can go to the next slide. Or maybe I should have told them a little bit about Kodiak, sorry. Kodiak Island is, I think most people know it is an island that contains only brown bears, no black bears. And the bears there are known for their size. Grant can tell us how much bigger they actually are than other coastal bears. It's not a huge difference, is it, Grant?
They're really similar. We kind of joke they just have better marketing, but yeah, they're big.
That's kind of what I thought as well, but they're definitely coastal bears and, and known to subsist on salmon. And when Will started his work, I guess I can't speak for him, but the understanding was the salmon resource came in the late summer, and bears fed on that salmon resource and then switched to feeding on what's a local name for the berries that they're eating on Kodiak, Grant? It's elderberries?
Yeah, they go a lot of salmonberry, they'll eat currants. There's quite a few species that they'll consume for sure.
Okay. And the story is that these bears were thought to be able to use both resources, and both resources were key to their their well-being. And as the climate has warmed, the ripening of the berry crops on the island has moved forward as much as 2 weeks. And that's brought in the berry resource peaking closer to when the salmon abundances are peaking. So, and some bears are deciding not to eat salmon and switch right to the berry resource. And others are leaving salmon earlier than before and switching to the berry resource. The question then becomes, how does this impact individual bears, or how does this impact the bear population? As the climate warms more, the two resources will overlap virtually entirely, and that will force bears to decide which resource to exploit, or whether they can exploit both of those resources at the same time. There are similar scenarios in other parts of the brown bear range where the two resources overlap now. And bears seem to choose, my observation is smaller bears tend to be more likely to choose berries over salmon, and larger bears will tend to choose salmon over berries. But as the climate warms, there will be more of these sort of asynchrony events going on. And the question then is, how will that affect the individual bears and the bear population? And Grant, do you have anything more to add to that? You know this system better than I do.
I think you sort of alluded to it. And one thing that we're seeing in a variety of studies, and what we actually saw it in the next study we'll talk about, is it does seem like we end up with bears making a choice as to which of the two resources they want to focus on. Sometimes we end up with these bears that tend to stay high and don't come down and utilize salmon, even though it's available. And so it's sort of these two different life history strategies. And I guess one thing we ponder is that something that, if a bear is a mountain bear, are they a mountain bear for their whole life, or is it something that they're doing largely because maybe they're at a reproductive stage where they feel more vulnerable, if you will? But based on what we were seeing in Gates of the Arctic, we'll talk about next, we really felt like we almost had functionally two different animals. We had mountain animals, we had salmon animals. I'll allude to that here in a second. But in essence, on Kodiak, that wasn't the case for a long time, but as things converge, we may start seeing more and more of that. But I know in Southeast Alaska too, they definitely see some brown bears in coastal areas that seem not to fish hardly at all.
And we saw that on the Skeet River in northern British Columbia, where there were small grizzly colored bears living at higher elevations, and they did not appear to come down to salmon at all, even though it was a massive salmon resource. So that system does appear to be in place in other places.
Yep.
It's interesting that Kodiak may be moving towards that kind of a system.
All right, we'll move on to Gates of the Arctic now. So our next study area was Gates of the Arctic National Park. And the reason the park asked us to do this particular study is there's a mining district just to the west of the park, and there's no road access at present. But when this park was formed, there was basically an authorization for an easement for the state to put a road through the bottom part of the park. And as the state's been more interested in developing that area, the park wanted to do baseline studies to get a better sense of what different animals, different resources, how they could be impacted by different road choices. And so this is a northern system. And even though there's a lot of green right here, we certainly didn't think about this as being a salmon driven system. It's on our study area was the south side of the Brooks Range. So it's part of the broad Yukon River drainage. But it is above the Arctic Circle. So we're looking at a really short growing season, obviously incredibly long days in the summer, but really rough winters, cold and dark. So when we put this study together, we had it designed in a lot of ways very similarly to the study on the Katmai coast. We were putting out, in this case, probably closer to 30 or 40 collars. Just it's such a big landscape. We wanted to get a better sense of what bears were doing. And what became surprising to us was what a huge proportion of the diet salmon was for these bears. And in fact, we didn't go in necessarily thinking about salmon. What happened is the bears started showing us where the salmon were, because if we were following bears, we were able to identify an additional 600 kilometers of anadromous streams that had not been documented before. And so we saw it both from the location data, but going out and flying bears and actually seeing them fishing and catching fish in places we didn't know fish existed. But then when we got the isotope data back, we saw, you know, not only were they utilizing it, but it was a really important resource for some individual bears and segments of the population. And just to return to what Garth and I were talking about a second ago, we almost had to, for lack of a better word, almost like morphological types of bears. We had some very small bears that stayed almost exclusively in the mountain. They were an adult female would be 120 pounds and would have, you know, 3 cubs with her. So they were really small, but they were productive. And then we had these other sets of bears that were spending time in lower areas, which in the spring we give them access to calving moose or carrion. But in the fall, we give them access to salmon. And they tended to be certainly not as big as coastal bears, but much larger than those mountain bears. And we almost saw a 2 to 3-fold difference in body size within this population. So just some really different life history strategies going on, or ways of making a living. So this one ties back to salmon again, more than we thought. But something that is of interest or concern is, as we were doing this study, one of my colleagues was doing work on the Yukon salmon fishery. And what she was seeing there is, because of warming freshwater temperatures in the streams, is indication of heat stress in more than half of the salmon that they assessed. And so, you know, certainly there are limits within which you don't see impacts to salmon. And salmon, you know, would have the ability to evolve to an extent to changing temperatures, but it's just not something they can do quickly. And so in this case, the Yukon River fishery comes out of the Bering side and not the Gulf of Alaska side. So even though they might not have been exposed to the warming events in the marine environment, they were seeing impacts of warming that was occurring in the freshwater environment. And I think I'm going to hand back to Garth now.
Yeah, I just want to talk about some observations that we're hearing from various people that live on the coast of British Columbia. And I'll start by talking about a study that Stefan Himmer and John Belanger did almost 20 years ago now. And it was a very fortuitous bit of work, because they were working on an inlet in central British Columbia. And they had started some monitoring work after a long period of decline in sockeye number, in sockeye returns, about 40 years of decline, it seems, or 30, depending where you want to draw your cut point. And that gave the first picture we had of how the system might change when there is a really dramatic decline in sockeye numbers or salmon numbers. Grant, you could probably switch to the next slide now. So the sockeye run did not collapse in the mid-90s. It really did hit bottom in the late 90s, but it had been declining for a long time. This is a long fjord that ends in a series of moderate-sized lakes. And so that the sockeye, young sockeye rear in. And so it's a very productive sockeye system, or had been a very productive sockeye system. So this is just south of Bella Coola, so on the mid coast of British Columbia, for those of you who know that area. The reason for that, I've talked to a number of people, 2 of my buddies from university worked on this system. They don't really know why. They blame it in some offshore event as opposed to an inshore event. It wasn't a highly impacted ecosystem at all. There is actually no way to drive there at all, still to this day. The grizzly bear detections along the salmon streams declined right at the very lows. And then the last year of their work, the salmon numbers started to come up, and they started to see more bears again on the streams. Slight changes now. There had been some work done, not near as, what's the word? not a systematic work done on sightings in previous decades, and the general feeling was there was many more bears sighted along the rivers before Stefan started the work. At the same time that happened, we did some diet, or just after that, we did some diet analysis along the coast, and there was still salmon in the diet of these bears during this sampling period, but it was about half, around 30% of their diet was salmon, as opposed to 60%, which is more the average in that area of the coast. So seems like their ability to assimilate salmon was reduced at this time. And we also know that many bears were killed in communities near one community in particular, but several other communities around the mid-coast. And so like Grant, we don't know what proportion of these bears actually died versus what proportion actually just switched to an alternative food source. But there was big changes in the community, and certainly the salmon resource was not as accessible, not as accessible, and not near as much used by bears at that time. And Grant, maybe you could go to the next slide. I showed you that ugly looking photo there because I think many of you know that when bears are eating salmon, and there's lots of salmon, especially later in the salmon season where they've already assimilated enough protein, they tend to eat the brains and the skin. And if they're lucky enough to catch a fish with roe in it, they'll eat the roe, because those are the fattier portions of the salmon. And you see this over and over again. I was just on a river, on Chilco River, just a month and a half ago, and there was 1 million sockeye returned to this stretch of 15 kilometers of river, and there was virtually no bears eating salmon. They were just eating brains and skin. What we are hearing along the coast of British Columbia is there's declines in returns of all species of salmon. Not in all places and all times, and it varies, but many, and certainly the sockeye and the chum salmon, which are focus for many of the brown bear systems, but also pink salmon as well. And in the last decade or 2 decades, there's been large increases in conflict of grizzly bears. Many local people blame that on an increase in abundance in bears. Others say it's a change in their behavior. There's certainly good evidence to suggest that the conflicts that are going on now did not happen before. There's numerous examples of fruit trees that have never had a brown bear in them, or other scenarios like that. Salmon fishing camps that have never had a bear break in, and now regular conflict. We also know that the bear's use of salmon streams does not decline right away. Like, there's obviously a satiation, or a point where that there's more salmon than bears need, and when bears stop using salmon streams, it's at very much lower numbers than they were before. You're almost at a point where the return is measured in hundreds. And we've seen that in a number of streams along the coast. There's a similar thing going on our coast in terms of just the broader vertebrate community. There has been a large recovery in seal numbers and sea lion numbers over the last 40 or 50 years. The sea otters have been increasing along the British Columbia coast in sort of here and there. And we've been hearing from a lot of First Nations communities that as sea otters recover, the clam populations decline precipitously. And there is certainly some conflict between First Nations and their traditional clamming practices and sea otter recovery. So that's going on in many places of the coast. And I think the last question sort of goes back to the work that Will Deasy did on Kodiak, and that is, how does this change in these resources on the edge of the coast, if it's a seal, as Grant alluded to, or a sea otter, or further inland in terms of salmon abundance? How do those change in those resources affect the population size and the individual health of both the black and brown bears along the coast? There's a couple of observations that I just want to mention that line up with what Grant told you earlier. very commonly we've seen large declines in salmon abundance and no obvious decline in body condition of bears on the coast. We have a few instances where there were bears seen in areas and reported that appeared to be in poor body condition, but for the most part, that's not been the case. And I think the last summary I'm going to pass to Grant, because I forgot my last point.
We've got time, Garth, when it comes back.
Yeah, maybe I'll remember it.
Yeah, so our conclusions, just, climate change is something that I think we all know is impacting terrestrial habitats. And these are fairly obvious, but I think as we've been doing some of these recent studies, we're starting to realize how influential these marine processes can be. And also going back to that very first map that we showed, just to realize geographically what a massive area this has the potential to impact. I'll say as a scientist, it's really been an exciting decade or so, because we largely went in, I think, collectively, both the studies I was involved in, but also the peers are working on, we kind of thought we knew how coastal systems work. And we just got surprised time after time after time. And one, in terms of how flexible diet can be, how bears can retain a healthy body condition as resources shift, but they can only do that when alternative resources are available. And so I think we're trying to figure out with these different populations, where, if any, thresholds exist that really become cause for concern. So I think the one thing for me going forward is, as we think about designing our next set of studies, is our original hypotheses, like the Katmai study, were lacking, and that's on me. I just wasn't thinking about all the drivers that could be impacting the system, and in sort of in particular, like that relationship between bears and sea otters. We had two different disciplines, or two different groups of species that were doing work literally in systems that touched each other. And if we didn't happen to have a history of otter work on the Katmai coast and a little bit of historical work on brown bears, I'm not sure that we would have started thinking about this linkage. So anyway, it's just, I think, for me going forward, and part of the reason we put the article in International Bear News, and wanted to give the presentation is, I was lacking in my breadth of thought when I designed these studies. So we just wanted to share our stories. So as folks are working in their areas, that if there are potential implications, it's one of the things that folks think about. So with that, I think that ends sort of our formal presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and we're happy to take any questions or comments. But before I do that, I just want to thank Rich and Chris again for the invitation. And I want to thank Garth for putting this together with me. It's been fun to reconnect and talk a bit. So.
The thing I wanted to add was just to add to Grant's point, that I was up in Bella Coola last summer or 2 summers ago. I can't remember. My brain's been fogged by COVID, but and one of the conservation officers was, we have a lot of grizzly bear conflicts in Bella Coola. It's the highest place of conflict in British Columbia regularly. And the first place she took me to was a wharf, a federal fisheries landing wharf, because she had this sow grizzly was stalking seals in the wharf and killing seals and then dragging them up to the shore. And she was concerned that the bear was going to defend the seal when people were coming down to go and get on their boat and go fishing. And so that was one of her problems that I never expected when I got off the plane in Bella Coola. But as Grant said, the brown bears are an extremely resourceful animal, and what, it makes me wonder how these changes in resources, are they flexible? And we know that they can adapt basically multiple life history strategies in the same place, and maybe that's what we're going to see. And brown bears are so adaptable that they're actually just going to modify their life history strategy, and that's how they're going to deal with climate change. I'll stop there.
I was gonna respond to one comment in the chat. and that was from Brian, just, surprised that bears would select berries over salmon. And I think, I was a little bit surprised too. I think, one, there are advantages to bears consuming a mixed diet. I know a lot of Charlie's work, is focused on that through time. And so I think that's sort of one of the questions like with Kodiak is, if we really get to a point where those resources overlap and they're geographically separated enough that it would limit sort of that dual consumption, that could be an issue. The other thing is I think, we also know, bears can make a good living on vegetation, but there are limits to body size. And so when we start thinking about like the overall niche, it's a little bit about dietary niche. There's almost like this physiological niche too, based on body size and what they're hitting. And one of the things that Garth and I talked about last week, and it was just a little bit late for us to put it in, but there's been some really interesting work over on Hokkaido by some of the folks that are doing brown bear research in in northern Japan, and there it's solely brown bears on the island. But when you look at how they sort of function ecologically, there are brown bears in some areas that ecologically seem to be filling the role that black bears would play if black bears were there. And so that's just sort of the plasticity we see in the resources they use and the way they respond.
So Grant, just to round that off, I mean, you didn't see it being a dominance issue or a protection of cubs issue. It was just kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to some of the work we did in the Kenai in the mid 90s, and so part of what was unique with the Kenai is they had all 5 species of salmon. They had runs on the Kenai. And they also had early and late runs of some species. And so salmon was basically available from June until October. And what we would see there is males and lone females tended to hit the streams first. And then females with, say, yearlings and 2-year-olds would come a little bit later. And then females with spring cubs may not hit the streams until far later. And so that's one of the things, if we either see reduction in salmon available or reductions in which species are present or shifts in sort of the timing, it may eliminate the ability for sort of that staggered approach, which I guess we'd sort of speculate was tied a little bit to a dominance hierarchy, if you will. Like going back to the gates of the Arctic, there were just it seemed like 2 different sort of independent life histories between these mountain bears and these salmon bears. So, we did see more salmon consumption by males. And so it could be a bit of a dominance thing. It also could be just to maintain their body size. They have to find a denser nutrient source.
And I think that the cost of making fat from sugar is not that high. The cost of making fat from protein is very high, and they appear to go to great trouble to avoid doing that. But it's not that big a cost. So I think that it's not a huge decision. So if a bear is smaller and feeling threatened, or anything that might reason why it might switch from stream to berries, it may not be doesn't have to be a really big reason, because the cost is, at least if it's not a 400-kilo bear, a smaller bear, it's not that big a cost to make fat from sugar.
There were a couple other questions in the chat I can try and tackle. So one was from Travis, just asking, what proportions of the seals and the otters were the bears consuming. So we didn't see any selective feeding necessarily. That being said, we were in essence sort of seeing cached carcasses, but a lot of what was left was just skinned out almost to the skeleton. What I can't say for sure is that if that was all done by the bears, or if we had, ravens and other things that were coming over, eagles that might have been, kind of picking and cleaning those carcasses too. So, but we didn't see any, we don't have any indication of selective feeding. And then I think it was Joe. Let me scroll up, ask a question about isolating bivalves from other items through the stable isotope analysis. So on stable isotopes, they are really coarse And for us, it was more of a timing thing. We went in thinking that they would be showing up as a marine component in the spring, because at that point the salmon weren't yet available, and we just weren't seeing any kind of real marine spike in the spring diets. That being said, I think one place that we really benefited from that study is we didn't have a huge sample size of individual bears, but we had data streams coming from lots of different sources. We had the isotope work, we had the physiological work, we had the observational work that was going on. So we could look for places. Did we see sort of conflicts in our findings from those individual observations, or were they largely compatible? So that's why, as we came out of that, we really felt like there was a lot of sort of individual specialization. I showed the bears that were feeding on the whales. We had just a handful of bears that were feeding on sea otters. So I don't want to imply sea otters are a big part of the bear diet. It's just there's an interaction there, and the interaction might actually be more meaningful on the sea otter side. We also had one bear in particular that was really, really good at feeding on flounder. And that's one that we wouldn't have necessarily known. And if we only looked at isotopes, it might have confused us a bit, but that bear happened to have a video collar on. So we could actually see what she was doing. And she was feeding on flounder in much the same way that bears feed on salmon, in the sense that she would go out, she would catch a fish and eat a fish, catch a fish, eat a fish, do that for about 7 fish in a row, and then go sleep for about 8 hours. And then do it again. The things that are different about flounder, one is you have the right tide. And so it's all about the tide, where you are in the tide cycle to be able to catch flounder. But the other part that was really cool was, flounder are available year round. They didn't have to wait for the salmon to return. So this was something bears were consuming in early June, as opposed to waiting for that. So all that to say, Joe, I think if all we were relying on was isotopes, I've no doubt we would have missed a lot of the nuance to what's occurring there. I think, Garth, it looks like Lana's got a question for you.
Yeah, I see Lana's got a politically loaded question for me. I just want to add, Joe, to Grant's thing. We've been focusing on using hares for diet, but the limit with hares is that the window that they tell us about is only that one time of year. And so I think, using blood or muscle or other tissues can be really informative about that spring period of the year, which we, do not learn about from using hair for diet. That's why live captures, if you pull blood, can be very helpful for that sort of seasonal aspect. Lana, in answer to your question, I don't know the answer to it. I think there's two things here. One is, in British Columbia, we're not well connected with the people who manage salmon, because they're from the federal government and they do it without us, and we go, there's not good synergy between the two governments, I must say. And that, I think, has to change in order for us to actually hope to manage ecosystems instead of just individual species for fish, maximizing harvest or maximizing the number of bears in the landscape, or whatever your individual goal is. The only thing I can say about habitat, and will that be either less impacted in the future or considered, is that they have at least changed the Forest Act last month, and everybody, all what I hear from friends who are on the inside of that is that it's a big improvement over what it was, and that may allow some options for things like reclamation and or changes to how they build roads in the future and things like that.
Yeah, I saw another question in the chat from Dick. You're kind of just discussing the role males play on salmon streams. Are they defending just their sort of prime fishing spot or whole stretches of streams? And I guess coupled with that is, why are some females maybe choosing not to go there? Is it a risk avoidance thing? It's not that I have an answer, Dick. I guess from what I've seen, I think it's probably highly variable. It almost depends on the stream, and how many fishing spots there are and how big the run is. Just just sort of the physical structure of different streams and where fish tend to pool and where they can be caught, I think might be variable enough. But I do think what's interesting, more sort of in the area where you work and thinking about what we were seeing in Gates, those tend to be sort of these narrower, long stretches. And so I think if there is any defense going on, I don't necessarily know that bears are defending a particular fishing spot, where you say, as opposed to kind of coursing the length of the stream and seeing where the fish are pooled and where they could potentially catch them in riffles. That was an unsatisfactory answer, Dick. I'm sorry.
And I guess I would add that I think it could be quite different between individual bears and, let's say, a medium-sized black bear and a larger threatening bear, whether it's female or male black bear, and a female bear that has cubs, who is, and especially female brown bears, who are quite defensive and also quite concerned about the risks to the cubs. Black bears seem to get salmon out of systems. They did that on the Skeet, where there was just brown bears everywhere, and yet black bears were eating salmon all over the place, but they just carefully avoided the brown bears and came to the edges of the streams, got one fish and took it out. And they tend to, my limited work with black bear diet is, they don't seem to have near as high of salmon signatures, and they don't seem to want to eat vast amounts of salmon in many places. And so they would get 15 or 20 or 25% of their diet would be salmon in a stream that was heavily dominated by brown bears. And they just were careful how they did that. I don't know that sows with cubs did that, but many of the black bears were able to get salmon regularly out of the system by just being cautious. And I don't think the male can defend a large portion of a stream. It can defend its fishing site, but not much more than that.
I think we have a study coming up that we're just launching on the Lake Clark coast. And what's different between the Lake Clark coast and the Katmai coast is the Lake Clark coast does have black bears as well. So we're really curious about that relationship. And I think the other species that can be a big player that we've underappreciated before is our wolves. The more we look at wolves and see what they're doing, we're seeing in these coastal areas incredibly diverse diets, including things like salmon and otter and other resources as well. And frankly, wolves killing bear cubs as well. So, I know we're getting close to our time, Rich and Chris. Maybe I'll pause there and let you wrap us up.
Yeah, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks for presenting on this important topic. We're right there at the time frame. So great job, great talk, and some good questions. Again, just want to wish everyone a great holiday, and we'll be in touch soon.
Yeah, and just to close, we will have another webinar next month, and we will be sending out the notice of that webinar soon. So stand by. So thank you, guys. It was an excellent presentation, and we hope everybody enjoyed it. Have a happy holiday.